Okay, I should clarify. Boring doesn't equal bad. Boring is its own thing, different from bad. And boring, as with most things horological, it's subjective. One person's boring is another person's tasteful or refined or even classic. So I'm not saying the Rolex Datejust 41 is bad. I'm not saying the Datejust 41 is distasteful. I'm just saying it's the most boring Rolex. These are two of the latest Rolex Datejust 41 watches, and despite looking slightly different, they actually have the same reference number, 126300. The dial and bracelet, that's all. Those are the differences. And it's only the bracelet that accounts for the price difference here. A fully steel Datejust 41 with a smooth bezel and an oyster bracelet is $7,900, or with a Jubilee bracelet, it's $8,150. And those prices, from what I can tell, with a little patience, in October 2022, you can actually buy these watches from an authorized dealer, again, with a little patience. You see, nature is healing. As the name tells you, this is a 41mm watch. I measure it at 11.8 millimeters thick, 47.5 millimeters long, and 21 millimeter lug widths. It also has a water resistance of 100 meters. On the Oyster bracelet, the watch weighs about 134 grams, and on the Jubilee, it's about 128, but that's sized to my 7-inch wrist, so that's with a few links removed. And what's so boring about these watches? In two large categories, the design of the watch and what this watch represents. I'll explain. Let me start with the easy part, the design. The smooth, polished bezel, the baton markers, the stick hands, the simple case shape, the nothing. There's nothing very interesting here. It's all just kind of forgettable. Really, the most eye-catching part of this whole situation is the date magnifier, the Cyclops, and that's bordering on offensive. People like me who spend a lot of time with Rolex watches, after a while we forget how bizarre that Cyclops is. And I'm not saying these watches are ugly, I'm not. Ugly would at least be interesting. That's one of my greatest assets personally, ugly is something. These just don't inspire a whole lot of feeling either way from me, and that's too bad. And I'm specifically referring to this reference with the smooth bezel. I like the fluted bezel. That bezel adds a lot of character to the Datejust watches. It screams Rolex, but hey, at least it screams. These don't scream or make any kind of strong statement. They just sit quietly in a booth in a mediocre restaurant until someone pays attention to them, and even then all they do is say something forgettable about the weather. And yeah, maybe I'm exaggerating. I mean, I like the weather, I'm a big fan. And I kind of think that that's the point of these watches. They do look nice and attractive to some people, but not too nice and not too attractive. And I even think the 41mm diameter is the most uninteresting size for the Datejust. Despite what I hear in the watch collecting echo chamber, most men still prefer larger watches. Go to a bar or an airport and look what most dudes are wearing. I think a 36mm Datejust on a wrist like mine is really a good look. I think it speaks to a kind of vintage appreciation and a confidence that a lot of men just don't have. A 41mm watch, it's obvious. Which brings me to what these watches represent, the second category of boring. What does Rolex mean to people? To most people, Rolex means luxury, an expensive object that is unnecessary and exists solely for enjoyment. And to a lot of people, Rolex is the pinnacle of watchmaking. They're wrong, it's not, but ask some non-watch people to name what they think is the finest watchmaker in the world, and I think you'll hear the name Rolex a nauseating amount of times. And so, to many buyers, this watch is a status symbol and a signifier of something accomplished. Get a new job, a raise, a little money in your pocket, buy a Rolex. And which one do you get? The most unoffensive one you can find, the Datejust 41. Now, maybe a person buys this because they find it attractive, but I suspect that many people choose this because 1, it's a Rolex, 2, it's a Rolex, and 3, it's a Rolex that doesn't look too stylized. And that's a damn shame because I think a lot of people don't understand how special these watches are. That's right. Despite the fact that I think these are boring in many ways, they're also amazing in many ways that maybe only watch nerds know about. Criticizing watches is easy and fun, 10 out of 10 would recommend. But nearly as fun is appreciating watches, and there's a lot to appreciate about these Datejust 41s. As someone who owns Rolex watches, the first thing that comes to mind is quality. These are good. These are really good. You can look at any part of a modern Rolex watch and find wildly impressive and interesting and subtle engineering. From the bracelet clasp with its spring-loaded release and extension system, to the impossibly tight end-link tolerances, to the movement inside these watches, and it's the movement that I think is the most impressive thing about these. Inside these is the Rolex 3235 Movement. It's a relatively young movement that came out only in 2017, so it has a bunch of improvements over the 3135, which was no slouch, I tell you what. The 3235 beats at 4 Hz or 8 ticks per second. It's anti-magnetic thanks in part to the blue parachrome hairspring, and it features a new escapement system called Chronergy, which is easier to write than it is to say. Chronergy. The new system has a different design to the escape wheel, to the pallet fork, and the pallets, and the result is less mass and more efficiency. That's why, without changing how energy is stored, the 3235 has an increased power reserve, about 70 hours in total. And what good would a power reserve be if the watch was inaccurate? And to me, this is the most impressive part about the movement. For decades, Rolex has stamped its watches with the text "Superlative Chronometer officially certified," but just in the last few years, the brand changed what that means. So in 2016, Rolex started certifying some of its new watches as being accurate to -2 to +2 seconds per day. That's very, very accurate for a mass-produced mechanical watch. And unlike most certifications by COSC, Rolex tests the movements after they've been placed into the watch cases. -2 to +2 seconds per day. Is that better or worse than what Omega is doing with the METAS certification? METAS accuracy is 0 to +6 seconds per day. In my experience, Rolex movements tend to be more accurate, but that's only me looking at like 5 watches from each watchmaker, so it ain't science. And it's also worth mentioning that Rolex recommends servicing its newer watches only once every 10 years. That speaks to a real confidence of quality. Compare that to, Grand Seiko, which I adore. Grand Seiko recommends servicing its watches every 3 to 4 years, which is much more common in the industry. I feel like 10 years, that really says something about Rolex. When I look at the Datejust 41 on my 7-inch wrist, the thing that excites me most isn't the name on the dial per se, and it sure as hell isn't the look of these, but it's the decades of innovation that went into this specific watch running at perfect accuracy somehow. The accuracy of a watch rarely improves the way I live my life, but I'm still impressed by it. So despite all the hype and the inflated prices and the status symbol bullshit, Rolex does make some very good watches. And the Datejust 41 with the smooth bezel is cool in its own way, if you know what you're looking at. And maybe it's not the most boring watch in the world, but I still contend that it is indeed the most boring Rolex watch.